right, so it is my pleasure to introduce J.A. Jance. J.A. is the top 10 New York Times bestselling author of the Joanna Brady series, the J.P. Beaumont series, and 3 interrelated thrillers featuring the Walker family, and Edge of Evil, the first in a series featuring Ali Reynolds. Born in South Dakota and brought up in Bisbee, Arizona, J.A. lives with her husband in Seattle, Washington, and in Tucson, Arizona, excuse me. I was doing so well. All right, so let's give a big virtual round of applause to J.A. And J.A., you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Actually, that's Tuscany on the wall behind me. That's a scene from Tuscany. That's why you bumbled Tucson and Tuscany. It was the influence of that painting.
Thanks for saving me. Okay.
I'm happy to be here today, and I'm very happy to tell you that yesterday I received a phone call from my editor in New York saying that Missing and Endangered will debut at number 10 on the New York Times list, on the New York Times hardback list, and it will debut at number 6 on the combined hardback ebook list. So thank you to all my readers who made that possible. Those of you who go out and vote early and often, I really appreciate you. I've done very few live events in the Boston area. So I thought today I'd give a little bit of my background because I think it's important for readers to have some idea about the person behind the words. As he said, I was born in South Dakota. We moved from a farm in northeastern South Dakota to Bisbee, Arizona in 1949 due to my father's health. He had been bedridden with arthritis in South Dakota, and the doctor told him we needed to move to a high, dry climate. And Bisbee, a copper mining town in southeastern Arizona, was, it turns out, just what the doctor ordered. And my father recovered his health completely. In Bisbee, I attended Greenway School, and in 2nd grade, Mrs. Spangler's 2nd grade classroom, I encountered the works of Frank Baum. Mrs. Spangler had shelves of books over under the window in her classroom. And if you finished your work early, you could go over and take one of those books, bring it back to your desk and read it. And Mrs. Spangler had all kinds of Oz books, not just Dorothy and the Ruby Slippers, but all those other Oz books as well. And as I started reading them, I wasn't so much smitten by the wizard hiding behind the curtain as I was by Frank Baum hiding behind the words. And as soon as I realized a living, breathing person put those words on the paper, that's who I wanted to be, and that's what I wanted to do. And there were lots of obstacles to making that happen, but I never ran out of determination. Someone asked me once, if you were going to describe yourself in one word, what would it be? And I think that word would be determined. I grew up, I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona in Tucson. I was the first member of my family to receive a 4-year degree. When I got to the university, because I wanted to be a writer, I signed up to be an English major. And then in 1960, I worked my way through college. I lived in a dorm, Pima Hall, where we did all our own cooking. It was a co-op. We did all our own cooking and cleaning. It was very inexpensive. We paid $1 a day for 3 meals a day. That's a real bargain. And I worked 15 hours a week in the English department. One of my jobs was to place the faculty members' mail in their individual mailboxes. The summer between my sophomore and junior year, when it was time to start signing up for the upper division classes, I was putting up mail, and the guy who taught the creative writing class came into the room. And I turned to him and I said, "Oh, I'm hoping to sign up for your class this fall." And he looked at me and he said, "You're a girl." And I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers." And he wouldn't let me into his class. Now, what did I do? I got a teaching degree in English. I wasn't allowed in the class. I married a guy who was allowed in the class that was closed to me. Uh, my first husband imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little. He never had anything published, but that didn't keep him from telling me in 1968, there's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it, which explains why I didn't actually start writing my first novel until 12 years later, when I was a single parent, divorced single parent with 2 little kids and a full-time job selling life insurance. But one of the wonderful things about being a writer is that you can sort of use everything you encounter. And in my first Walker family book, a book called Hour of the Hunter, oh, when I wasn't allowed into in the creative writing program, I became first an English teacher, and then I spent 5 years as a K through 12 librarian on the Tohono O'odham Reservation west of Tucson. And in the first Walker book, the main protagonist is a woman named Diana Ladd. She's a teacher on the reservation, but she really wants to be a writer. Like me, she had a husband who was allowed in a creative writing program that was closed to her. Her husband is dead at the beginning of the book. And as for the crazed killer, he turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. So there you have an example of writerly revenge. It's a very bad idea to make writers mad because we have our ways of getting even, and believe me, we do. In 1982, my first husband died. He died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. And actually, After the Fire is, it's the story of that journey. It's poetry. While I wasn't allowed to be a writer, we lived 30 miles from town, 2 miles from the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and/or telephone. And most evenings he was passed out cold by 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night. So I was there by myself. And I wasn't supposed to be a writer. But the thing about writers is they write anyway. And so in the evenings, I would sit at the dining room table and jot out these little pieces of poetry. And eventually, those poems, written over a 20-year period, became After the Fire. And they sort of tell that story. The title poem goes like this: I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. My first husband was sort of a dead loss as far as husband material is concerned. But from the point of view of a writer, the guy was a gold mine. And so when I sat down to write my first Beaumont book, I sat down to write a book, and it happened to be about a character named Beaumont. I had no idea that when an editor bought it, that they would buy it as the first book in the series. And I certainly had no concept that all these years later, I would currently be working on Beaumont number 25. But when I sat down to write that first book, I spent 3 months trying to get it to come into focus, and the story wouldn't work. And it turned out I was trying to tell the story through the wrong point of view. Finally, after about 6 months, it was spring. My kids were still in grade school. I sent them off to a camp for 5 days for spring break. And I sent myself to Portland on the train to stay with a friend for a few days, a friend I had met in the life insurance business. I got on the train with a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of pens. And as the train pulled out of the King Street station, I thought, what would happen if I wrote this book through the detective's point of view? So I pulled out a notebook and I started writing. She might have been a cute kid once. That was hard to tell now. She was dead. And as soon as I wrote those words, I was in J.P. Beaumont's shoes, walking around a crime scene on the backside of Magnolia Bluff. I was seeing what he was seeing. I was hearing what he was hearing. I heard what he was saying, but I also heard what he was thinking. And Beaumont and I have been author and character since that day in 1983. At the end of 1982. Oh, okay, so sorry. I went a little off track. When I started writing about Beaumont then, I wrote those books in the first person through his point of view. And it was not easy because he was a male. I was not a male. He was a cop. I had never been in law enforcement. He was a Seattle native. I had lived in Seattle for less than a year. So I had to do a lot of work to make that work. And writing in the first person requires a real focus because the reader only knows what the main character has seen, said, heard, or done. There's no other information available. So as I started writing about Beau, he couldn't work all the time. So I had to have something for him to do when he wasn't working. I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program, but I'm smart enough to figure out that you write what you know. And I happen to know a whole lot about drinking. So Beau did the kind of drinking that I had lived with for 18 years. I put it in the background of the stories as sort of stage business. But 4 books in, readers started saying, when I was at a signing in Portland, and a woman came up to the table and she said, J.P. Beaumont drinks every day. He has a drink of choice. It's starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem? And I said, these are books. But more readers told me that. And eventually I figured out my readers were right and Beau did have a problem. And so that's how he ends up having his first undeniable blackout in book number 7. He's in treatment in number 8. And so I'm working on book number 25 now. So he's been sober a lot longer than he was drinking. I still have readers who tell me they liked him better when he was drunk. I worry about those folks. But I wrote 9 Beaumont books in a row. And I was getting tired of him. And my editor said, well, when I threatened to knock him off, he said, well, you remember that first book you wrote that nobody ever bought? Why don't you rework that and we'll make that be your first hardback? And I did rewrite it. And it's a completely different story than it was when I wrote it in that unpublished manuscript. But that became Hour of the Hunter, the first Walker book. And when I went back to write about Bo, it was fun again. So my editor said, well, why don't you come up with a new character, and then you'll be able to alternate between that character and Beaumont. So I thought, here's an idea. Why don't I write something in third person instead of first person? I'm a woman. How about if I use a female protagonist? I know a lot more about the desert and growing up in Arizona than I knew about Seattle. So why not set it in Arizona? So that's how Joanna Brady came into being. And what people can't tell from me, and what they can't tell from looking at my picture on book covers, is that I'm tall. I'm 6'1", and I was 6 feet tall in seventh grade. I've always wondered what it would be like to be short, and so I decided to make Joanna Brady short. She's 5'4". There are a few books where I messed up, and she sort of goes up and down between 5'2" and 5'4", but I think we pretty much settled on 5'4" now. So when I'm writing a Joanna Brady book, I have to put myself and my mindset in her physical frame. For instance, I know a lot of things about the top of Joanna Brady's refrigerator that she'll never even guess. So that's how Joanna came along. So when I sat down to write Desert Heat, the first of those books, unlike writing the first Beaumont book, Until Proven Guilty, when I had no idea I was writing a series, in writing Desert Heat, I was cognizant of that fact. So the first scene in Desert Heat, Joanna is 27 years old. She has, well, she's 28. She has a 9-year-old daughter. She got pregnant at age 17. So she and her husband, Andy, had sort of a shotgun wedding. And so in the first scene in the book, Joanna is at home. It's the evening of her 10th wedding anniversary to Andy. And she's there with her 9-year-old daughter and her mother, Eleanor. And they're waiting for Andy to come home because Eleanor is going to babysit while Andy and Joanna go out to dinner. Well, Andy never bakes at home because he's been gunned down out on High Lonesome Road. But they're sitting there waiting, and Jenny is this bright little penny, and she's had a little bit of sex education at Greenway School. She counted up the months on her fingers, and it suddenly dawned on her that there weren't quite enough months between her 9th birthday and her parents' 10th wedding anniversary. So she says to her mom, was I a preemie? she could just as well have exploded an atomic bomb in the middle of that conversation, because Joanna's mother, Eleanor, has been on a tear forever over the fact that Joanna got pregnant while she was still in high school. And that conversation actually set up the storyline for that whole series of books, because Joanna and her mother have a very complicated relationship in which it turns out Joanna's mother, Eleanor, and Joanna's father had a baby out of wedlock, a boy that they gave up for adoption long before they married and long before Joanna was born. So what's interesting to me is I put that in on the first page, and yet that storyline has trickled through all the books in between. So readers who have followed the books from I grew up reading, somebody said, well, what do you read? I read Nancy Drew, what a surprise. I read the Dana Girls and Judy Bolton, what a surprise. And then I graduated to Zane Grey, I loved the West. And then I graduated to guys like Johnny D. McDonald and Travis McGee. And what disturbed me about Travis McGee is that he never seemed to learn things from one book to another. He still lived on the busted flesh. Some pretty new girl would catch his eye, and she was always bad news, but he was never smart enough to figure it out in advance. And so he was sort of, Travis McGee was sort of stuck in a Groundhog Day situation. And I decided I wanted my characters to live. So in the 19 book, Missing and Endangered is Joanna Brady, book number 19. And in the intervening books, we've seen Jenny grow up from being a 9-year-old to now being a sophomore in college. We saw her when her grandparents gave her her first horse, and now she's going to Northern Arizona University on a rodeo team scholarship. So people have a chance to grow and change. Joanna started out, she was in the insurance business, what a surprise. And then she is, after Andy's death, she's persuaded to run for office for sheriff. Her husband, Andy, was a candidate for sheriff when he died. And at the funeral, people say, hey, why don't you run in Andy's place? And so she did. And everybody sort of assumed that she would, when she won, they assumed that she would just be a placekeeper. But in the second book, she makes one of the 10 fatal errors that cops make, which is tombstone courage, failing to wait for backup. So in book 3, she sends herself to the academy. Now, so she starts out as a widow with a young child and a complicated job, unpredictable hours. And I thought she needed somebody to be in her life. Well, this guy shows up in book number 3. His name is Butch. And I thought Butch Dixon was a one-book character, but it turned out he just wouldn't go away. He kept coming back book after book. If I had had any idea when I first met Butch Dixon in Shoot, Don't Shoot, that he was going to end up being Joanna Brady's second husband and the father of 2 of her children, I would certainly have given him a better name, because Butch is sort of a silly name for somebody his age. But now you have learned a secret of my writing. I don't outline. I don't outline my series. I don't outline my books. I start at the beginning and I write to the end. Because I write murder mysteries, I usually start out with somebody dead, and I spend the rest of the book trying to figure out who did it and how come. So I don't, that being the case, you can pretty well guess I don't outline my series either. I don't know what's going to happen in my books until I get there and write it. Someone wanted to know what was the inspiration for Missing and Endangered. Well, because I'm not a cop, I've never been a cop. There's a lot of cop stuff that I need to learn. And in the beginning, I interviewed people at the cops at Seattle PD. I talked to people in the medical examiner's office. I talked to people in the crime lab. And as I told my grandson the other day, he asked me what it was like to be a writer. And I said, you know, when I started writing about Beaumont, it was the early 80s. If there was blood at a crime scene, all the cops could do was type it. They could know if it was AB positive, negative, O. So that could eliminate suspects, but it didn't really point to anyone in particular because there was no such thing as DNA. To begin with, the fingerprints that were available were the fingerprints in any individual police department on mounds of cards that had to be gone through on an individual basis. There was no, the automated fingerprint identification system that we have now was just a dream back in the early 80s. There was no DNA in the early 80s, and there was certainly no cell phone positioning, which could, or GPS positioning that could place a particular individual at the scene of a crime. And now I read about a case where a guy's wife died. He said he was innocent. He was someplace else when that happened. But her Fitbit told the authorities exactly when she stopped moving and stopped breathing. And that blew up his alibi. So these days, I watch a lot of true crime on TV. I listen to how the police conduct their interrogations. I watch how they narrow down the collection of suspects. And I pay attention to the kind of forensic science that comes into play to demonstrate what really happened as opposed to what people claim happened. So about a year and a half ago, I watched a show on ID Discovery called Web of Lies. And it was about a 16-year-old girl in Scottsdale, I believe, who took up with an online relationship with a guy who told her he was 2 years older than she was, and he sent her pictures of who he claimed he was, but in actual fact, he was a much older online predator. He sweet talked her into sending him nude selfies of her. And then when she tried to break off with him, he threatened to take the selfies public. And the young woman considered suicide, but eventually her mother found out what was going on, and the cops actually found this guy. But I watched that, and that went into my head. It did not go into my head in a fashion that said, oh, I think someday I'll use this as the background for a Joanna Brady book. No, it just went into my head. My husband, my second husband, the good one, claims that I have a wearing blender in my head, and things go into my head and they go through the wearing blender, and when they come out through my fingertips, they're different. I can give you an example of how that works. In the early 60s, my older sister and her husband had this little ranchette outside Bisbee, and they had a horse named Warpaint and a cow named Shirley and a pig whose name I've forgotten, and an Australian shepherd named Smoky Joe. Warpaint was the brains of the outfit, and he knew that if it rained, the electric fence would stop working and he'd let everybody out. So Smoky Joe could be counted on to help round up Shirley and the pig. But if Warpaint got out in the pasture, he was out in the pasture. And if you walked up to him with anything in your hand that resembled a rope or a bridle, he would stay just out of reach. So one day, my sister came home from work. It had rained. She got the pig and Shirley back put away, and then she went out to the pasture, and she wasn't carrying anything. And she walked right up to Warpaint, and she was sort of snuggling under his neck. And while she was snuggling, she reached up under her shirt, slipped off her bra, wrapped it around his neck, and led him home. Poor war paint. The world shifted on its axis, and he could never trust anybody after that. Decades later, I'm writing a Joanna Brady book number 5, Skeleton Canyon. She's out in the middle of nowhere, pinned down by gunfire, and she needs a diversion. She needs to make her opponent think there's somebody else with her. What does she do? She whips off her bra, she loads it with pebbles, and she uses it as a slingshot. Now, I can't explain to you the connection between my sister using her bra as a bridle and Joanna using hers as a slingshot, but I can tell you it does have something to do with the wearing blender. So when that web of lies went into the wearing blender, it came out in the persona of Beth Rankin in this book. It couldn't, Joanna's daughter, has grown up to be this very smart, resourceful, capable young woman. And when I started thinking about this, I thought, well, Jenny isn't going to fall for this guy, this online predator. So I ended up creating Jenny's book smart, but socially naive roommate, Beth Rankin. I read my emails. I read all of my emails. Emails come from readers. I reply to most of them, even the nasty ones. If I didn't reply politely, my mother would rise up out of her grave and slap me. So I have to respond politely at least once. Some woman wrote to me and said, "Why did you name Ali Reynolds' grandkids Colin and Colleen? Why didn't you use some other Irish name?" And well, I grew up in a family that had Janice, Jeannie, Janie, Judy, Jim. Giving siblings C names worked for me. And I wrote her a cute letter and explaining that. And she sent me back a catalog of names that would have been more appropriate. I did not reply the second time. My mother left me off the hook with just one reply, not two. But a woman wrote to me just after Christmas last year. And she explained that her son was emerging from a very abusive marriage in which he had been the primary victim. And when he filed for a divorce, his soon-to-be former wife accused him of molesting his daughters. And so at this point, he wasn't allowed even visitation with his daughters. And so the woman, the heartbroken grandmother, wrote to me and she said, "My granddaughters can't come visit, and I'm leaving my tree up with their presents under it until they can come visit in person and get them back." It's 15 months later. That Christmas tree from last year is still up. And so when I started writing this book, I was writing along and when I thought, when we hear that there's an abusive marriage, the assumption is always that the abusive spouse is the husband. And so that email caused a seismic shift in this book. And in this book, the abuser is the wife as opposed to the father. As I write along, characters come into focus for me. In this story, in Missing and Endangered, the character who won my heart is a little girl named Kendall, a 7-year-old girl in a very difficult family situation, who takes it upon herself to assume full responsibility for her 5-year-old brother. She is the one who, when the gunfire stops, looks out the window and sees her father bleeding out on the porch outside, but she doesn't tell her little brother because he's just a baby. So Kendall won my heart in this story. Now, people always ask, who are the people on the dedication page? And in this case, there are 3 people on the dedication page: Terry and Kathy and Rusty. Rusty wrote to me. Rusty is someone who has followed my books for decades. When he owned a bookstore, he would show up at book conferences with bags of books for me to autograph, and I always autographed all of them. After he sold the bookstore, he and Kathy turned up at venues all over Washington and Oregon. Wherever I was, there were Rusty and Kathy. I was writing this book, and he wrote to me to say that Kathy's Alzheimer's was getting worse. He was having a real struggle caring for her, couldn't get her to bathe, couldn't get her to eat, and he was looking for a facility where she could, and she wanted to divorce. She was mad at him, and she didn't know up from down, but she wanted to divorce him. So he wrote after he finally placed her in a care facility in December, and at that point, I needed a new character in Missing and Endangered. There's a dog in this book. There are dogs in my books because there are dogs in my life. With any luck, FedEx won't show up and you will not hear my dogs barking. If a delivery happens, all hell will break loose. But dogs turn up in my books because dogs turn up in my life. And in this case, there is a dog that has been abandoned, and I needed somebody to step up and rescue that dog. So I was shopping for a character, and I had just heard from Rusty, and I thought, well, I'll write Rusty into this book. He's a big fan. He always writes to me first thing by 10 o'clock in the morning on pub day. I'll get a note from Rusty saying that he already read the book because he gets it on his Kindle at midnight and stays up the rest of the night finishing it. So I created the character, named him Rusty Miller. So I knew that Rusty and Kathy and Terry in the dedication page is a lady who once drove 150 miles, 300 miles round trip to come to an in-person signing. And when she got there, the librarian in charge told her the room was full and wouldn't let her inside. So she has never attended a live event, but she is a very regular reader. She reads my blog, she reads my newsletters, she reads my books. So I decided to put Terry's name on the dedication page of this book, along with Rusty and Kathy. So pub day came, and I spent all day worrying about an upcoming Zoom presentation that night, because all too often my Zoom presentations turn into Zoomageddon. I don't even want to talk about some of those. So I was worried about that all day. And I had noticed that I didn't hear from Rusty that morning, but it was in the background. It hadn't really registered. The last I heard from him was just before Christmas, when he wrote to say that the restaurant where he was getting his takeout meals was going to deliver a free Christmas Eve dinner to him at his house. The evening of the publication day, I received a note from his daughter explaining that he had passed away on December 30th, without ever knowing that he was either in the dedication page or a character in the book. And I have to tell you, I blogged about that today. I'm so sorry. I wanted to keep it as a surprise, but by keeping it as a surprise, I kept him from knowing it. And so in the blog, I tell two people who are going to be in the next Beaumont book, guess what? It's coming because I don't want to make that same mistake twice. So that's sort of how the book came into being. The next Ali Reynolds book, again, what happened by the early 2000s, I was tired of everybody, of Joanna, the Walkers, Beaumont. And at that point, I wrote the first Ali Reynolds book. That was Edge of Evil. And Ali Reynolds number 17, Unfinished Business, is due out the 1st of June. And in that book, it's a book that has the Ali Reynolds books are published by Simon & Schuster. The Beaumonts, Bradys, and Walkers are from HarperCollins. But Beaumont, who has aged over the years, I gave him my birthday so I would be able to remember how old he is. In retirement now, he has started working cold cases on a volunteer basis. And when I was writing along in Unfinished Business, that Ali book, I could see that there was going to be a tie-in because there was a cold case that had connections to both Washington and Oregon, and who's working on cold cases in Washington but Beaumont. So I negotiated a peace treaty for my HarperCollins character, Beaumont, to do a cameo appearance in Unfinished Business. Like the Joanna books, the Ali Reynolds books are written in the third person. And I assumed that when I got to the J.P. Beaumont part of the book, he would be told in third person as well. No way, Jose. I got to that part of the book, and when I tried to write him in third person, it just wouldn't work. Beaumont lives and breathes in first person. So that part of that Ali Reynolds book is told through Beau's 70-something curmudgeonly point of view. So that book is due out. Unfinished Business is due out in June. And I'm working right now on the next Beaumont book, a book called Nothing to Lose. What I figured out so far is I know which character has nothing to lose, but I don't know how come or what's going to happen. So that's sort of what I have to say. Can we open it up for questions now?
Absolutely, J.A. So folks who are listening live, feel free to get some more questions into the Q&A, and we'll take about 15 minutes or so of questions. And J.A., you are a delightful speaker, and my emotions have gone up and down like a roller coaster while you've spoken tonight. You really had my attention for the full 45 minutes, I'll tell you that. First question, what is the best piece of writing advice you received that you still use?
My first husband died at the end of 1982. In the spring of 1983, I received a $50,000 life insurance death benefit. I had handwritten that first 1,400-page document, and I had started writing the first Beaumont book by hand. But when that death benefit came in, I decided to invest 10% of that, $5,000, in my future as a writer. And I taught myself to use the computer by typing in all of the poetry that I had written on little pieces of paper and hidden away over the years. So actually the first book I created on a computer was After the Fire. But I bought the computer, and the computer I bought in 1983 was an Eagle, not steam driven, but close, dual floppy. It had 128K of memory. If I wrote more than 2,500 words in a chapter, the cursor would freeze up. And it would take 3 of those 3.5-inch floppies to send a manuscript to New York. And of course, at that time, there was no such thing as email. You couldn't email a manuscript. So they also wanted a typed a paper and ink copy. And those had to be done on that daisy wheel printer with, when you're creating a 400-page document on a daisy wheel printer, the paper jams can just drive you absolutely bonkers. But those were the tools I had for probably the first 7 or 8 Beaumont books. But I bought them from a fellow named David Graham. At the time, I was a single parent, 2 little kids, no child support, a full-time job selling life insurance. And the time I had to write was from 4 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock in the morning, when I got the kids dressed to go to school and got me dressed to go to work. But David Graham fixed it so that every morning at 4 a.m., when I booted up my computer, these were the words that flashed across the screen. A writer is someone who has written today. Those were miracle words to me, because the world was full of people who said, I told them, well, I'm writing a book, and they'd say, yeah, yeah, yeah. But those words told me that as long as I was writing, I was a writer, even though nobody else in the world knew it or believed it yet. And so those words were a real gift to me. And they're a gift I share with other beginning writers. It's a lot easier to talk about writing a book someday than it is to actually put your butt in a chair, put your fingers on the keyboard, and write. And until I actually do that each day, I don't consider myself a writer. And right now, I don't qualify today. I've answered a lot of emails. I've done some Zoom work. I've got to do a 5-minute presentation for somebody else. But right now, today, I'm not yet a writer, but the day is young and I'll get it done. Just like between our initial encounter a couple of hours ago, I went out and walked 4 miles. I usually walk almost 6 miles a day. I do my 10,000 steps, and then in my natural habitat, all I get is 2,000 steps. So I'm coming up on 11 million steps of walking each and every day. And that's one of the things I do to keep myself healthy. It's not necessarily good for writing. I don't have a lot of good ideas while I'm out writing. I'm too busy counting steps. But that is one of the things I do to keep myself fit and to keep myself from turning into a COVID doorstop.
I know that JP Beaumont recently had knee surgery, knee replacement surgery. You okay with your knees?
My knees are just fine. The thing is, I don't have to do everything to learn about it. My husband had dual knee replacement surgery. And I use that as the beginning scene in a book called Second Watch. And I wrote about all of the things he was thinking as we were driving to the hospital. I drove him there. And when he read the book and he read that scene, he said, how did you know that? Well, I'm an observer. I was 6 feet tall in the 7th grade. I was very smart. I wore glasses, thick glasses. So I was a social misfit. And because I wasn't a social doer, I became sort of a perpetual outsider. And that gives me the ability to watch what's going on around me and learn from that. After my husband's surgery, he was very happy. He was on drugs, of course, and had incredibly vivid dreams. And so while Beaumont is recovering and is on those same medications, he has two very vivid dreams. One is about the first case, the first homicide he ever worked that was never solved. And the other is a dream about the guy who was his commanding officer in Vietnam. The commanding officer, Second Watch is a fictional book, but the commanding officer is very real. At Bisbee High School, I was a year behind a fellow by the name of Doug Davis. He was small, he was tall, he was handsome, he was whip smart. In the mornings when Mrs. Philippi would open the library, Doug and I would both be waiting outside the door. He would go straight to history. I went straight to fiction. He's the only kid in Bisbee High School who ever read The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire from beginning to end. He graduated as the valedictorian of the class of '61. He went from Bisbee High School to West Point. He went from West Point to Ranger School. He went from Ranger School to Vietnam, where he died weeks before his 23rd birthday. I was spending the summer in Las Vegas in 1966. And so I wasn't aware that he had died or that they had held his funeral in Bisbee until after the fact. So I never attended his funeral, and I always felt guilty that I hadn't been there. Then through a series of coincidences, I became first acquainted with and ultimately friends with a woman named Bonnie Abney, who was engaged to marry Doug at the time he died. So one Thanksgiving, we were sitting here having Thanksgiving dinner, and one son turned to me as only a 40-something son can do and said, "You know, Mom, J.P. Beaumont has been getting pretty long obtuse. Have you ever thought of writing a J.P. Beaumont prequel?" And I said, "No, Tom, I've never thought about that." But months later, when it was time to start the next Beaumont book, the idea of writing a prequel was the only idea I had. So I was sitting there thinking about how old Beau is because of how old I am. And I realized that he would have been a year older than Doug. And so I picked up the phone and I called Bonnie and I said, "Bonnie, what would you think if I entwined Doug's real story with Beau's fictional story?" And she said, "Let me think about that for a day or two." A couple of days later, she called me back and she said, "I think my Douglas would be safe in your hands." And so I wrote Second Watch. And I wrote it because, and in Second Watch, Beau learns that part of his problem is that he came home from Vietnam and Doug Davis, his commanding officer, never did. So he's in the hospital and he's having these very vivid dreams. And he opens his eyes and there's this guy looking out the hospital window at the Space Needle. And the guy is wearing a pair of Vietnam era military fatigues. And of course, Beau should have figured out immediately that this was totally wrong, since the Space Needle is in the opposite direction from that set of windows. But the guy turns around and comes sauntering across the room toward Beau's bed, and he recognizes Doug Davis. And Doug Davis walks up to him and says, you got old. And of course, that's true. Doug never had a chance to get old, and Beaumont did. And that's the beginning of that journey that finally takes Beau back to track down Bonnie Abney and tell her how sorry he was and what knowing Doug Davis meant to him. I wrote that book with the goal that somehow Doug and Bonnie's lives and their terrible sacrifices would be remembered. I wanted to turn one of those names chiseled into the wall in Washington into a living, breathing person. On the 50th anniversary of Doug's death, Bonnie went to Bisbee, Arizona. She spent most of the day at Doug's graveside in Evergreen Cemetery. And what she found there was that people who had read the book had found their way to Bisbee, found their way to the cemetery, located Doug's grave, and left behind tokens of their esteem. I no longer have to feel guilty about not attending Doug Davis's funeral.
J.A., well, wow. I make a joke about a knee replacement, and you provide me with that answer. Boy, you are the easiest interview ever. You make everything great. Who is your favorite character to write for, Joanna or J.P., or perhaps someone else?
I was raised in a family of 7 kids. Our mother, Evelyn, Evie, could just as well have been a drill sergeant. Otherwise, you can't get 7 kids to eat at the same time or be where they're supposed to be or do what they're supposed to do. And she was it. But she, in her world, you always had to eat a little bit of everything and everything on your plate. And there was no dessert until you had eaten everything on your plate. For me, my downfall was parsnips. For my younger brother, Jim, it was green peas. But so when I'm asked, what's my favorite character? My favorite character is always the character I'm supposed to write about next, as opposed to the character I'm supposed to be writing about right now. But I'm not allowed to think about that book or worry about it until I clean my plate of the one I'm working on right now.
And segue into our next question, and we have a few more questions, and then I'll let you go. Susan wants to know, it sounds as if you write all these series at the same time. How do you keep them straight?
Well, I don't write them at the same time. I am usually promoting one book, editing a book, editing another one, and writing a third. So I'm juggling all those, keeping all 3 balls in the air. But if I were trying to write more than one book at the same time, I would go nuts. But of course, if you've listened to me, you've probably already decided that I'm nuts anyway. But I think the fact that I have had multiple characters to work with over the years and multiple locales to use in the background has helped me be able to write one book after another. I could never have been Sue Grafton and started out to write 26 books in a row about the same character. I just couldn't have done it. And I'm very sorry Sue didn't get beyond Y, but I could not have been her. And so when it's time to take up with a character I've been away from for a while, it's like getting a holiday letter from people you care about, but you just don't see them. You want to know what's going on in their lives. And without that holiday letter, you would have lost track of them a long time ago.
A couple of questions that are related. Diane wants to know, who do you read for pleasure? And then we had a question submitted in advance asking what your favorite genre is to read.
Well, mysteries. I write what I love, and I read thrillers. My reading list is what you'd recognize: names Silva and Dan Silva and the Jack Reacher books, Michael Connelly. I like the Miss Julia books from Ann B. Ross. I like the Number One Ladies Detective stories from Alexander McCall Smith. But when I'm in the throes of writing a book, I can't really read other people's books. And that's just the way I'm built.
This question came up twice, so I'm going to ask it. When you write about real people in your life, do you have to obtain a written consent from that person?
Well, I very seldom write about anybody in real life. That is, the exception to that is the little girl in Sins of the Fathers. My husband and I have a trainer, a personal trainer. Now we see him on Zoom, but it used to be he would come to our house 3 days a week. And at this time, he was 70. And we had been in Arizona. We came home, and 70, divorced, lives by himself. So when it was time for our next workout, he showed up on our doorstep. And when I opened the door, he was standing there with an infant carrier with a baby in it in one hand and a diaper bag over his other shoulder. And we said, well, you've been busy. And he told us the story of a very troubled daughter and boyfriend who are deep into drugs. The daughter had a child, had the baby in the hospital, abandoned the drug addicted child in the hospital. And Dan went to the hospital, nursed the baby through withdrawal, and then took her home and raised her for 9 months on his own. And if that isn't the definition of a hero, I don't know what is. And so I used that story as the background for a Beaumont story, using a character from Beaumont book number 4, Taking the Fifth. But I used the example of Dan and his granddaughter, Athena, to create my fictional Athena. Now, you're going to have to excuse me for a moment. I'll be right back.
Sure. And folks, we'll be wrapping up just momentarily. If anyone has any additional comments or questions for JA, make sure to get them into the chat or the Q&A. And I do anticipate I have 2 more questions I want to ask, and we'll be wrapping up just momentarily. I'm not sure if the FedEx delivery man just showed up, so just bear with us.
So here's a picture of the real Athena holding her book. Dan has waged a 5-year battle to keep her from going into the system, and the adoption should finally become final within the next few weeks. But Dan is the reason this little girl is a bright and shiny penny. So she was a little too young to give me written permission to use her. I'd like to close this. As I mentioned, I was 6 feet tall when I was in 7th grade. I was always a social outcast. In the late 70s, I was living in Phoenix. I was thinking about getting a divorce, worrying about if I got a divorce, would I be able to keep a roof over our heads? Would I be able to feed my kids? So I drove from appointment to appointment, listening to music on my track cassette player. I listened to the music of Gordon Lightfoot. Cobwebs and dust, cobwebs and dust. I hate to leave you, but leave you I must. And then Helen Reddy, I am woman, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore. And then there was the music of Janice Ian. When I heard her song at 17 for the first time, I thought, wow, she and I have walked in the same moccasins. But then I found out she's only 4'10", and the moccasin thing just wasn't going to work. But that song really spoke to me. And so for years, I have ended my presentations by singing that song. The year my husband had his knee surgery, it was supposed to be in August, but suddenly it got moved up to June. And the weekend he was supposed to be released from the hospital to rehab, I was supposed to be speaking at a writers' conference in Boise, Idaho. So I said, okay, I told my daughters, I'm just going to call the writers' conference I'm going to see. My husband is in the hospital and I just can't come. And my daughter said, no, Mom, you gave your word. You keep your promise. We'll look after Dad. Well, doesn't it just annoy the hell out of you when your kids start spouting back the words you've always taught them? So I went to Boise. I was a keynote speaker at noon on Saturday, and I ended my presentation singing that song. Sunday night, when I got back home to Seattle, I opened my computer, and there was an email from Janice Ian. She said, hey, I heard you sang my song in Boise yesterday, and that you did a good job of it too. It turns out someone at the conference who was a fan of my work and Janice Ian's work had gone straight back home to Nashville and tattled on me. So that's how Janice Ian and I became acquainted. And over time, we became friends. And a couple of years ago in Tampa, I actually sang that song in a duet with Janice Ian. And that wasn't easy because she still has her full range of a voice. And she said, Judy, you sing in the key of R. So here, in the key of R, is Janice Ian's iconic song. I learned the truth at 17, that love was meant for beauty queens and high school girls with clear skin smiles who married young and then retired. The Valentines I never knew. The charades of At 17, I learned the Valentines I never knew spent on ones more beautiful. At 17, I learned the truth. And those of us with ravaged faces, lacking in the social graces, desperately remained at home, inventing lovers on the phone who called to say, come dance with me, and murmur vague obscenities at ugly girls like me at 17. It was long ago and far away. The world was younger than today, and dreams were all they gave for free to ugly duckling girls like me. And that's what my readers have done for me. They've made all my dreams come true. Thank you.